I was based down in Oakland area, and I came home from work, and Dale Borgeson came downstairs and told me to pack my things because I was going home, and that Silme and Jean had been shot, and they thought Jean was dead, and Silme was in the hospital. And I remember packing a suitcase, kind of thinking, well, I better take a black dress because I'll have to go to a funeral. But then I better take my Marxist-Leninist education project material with me because I'll be back for the weekend, and we have studies on Sunday mornings. As Joni had said, every Sunday morning we had studies. So in my mind, I kind of knew Jean was dead, but on the other hand, I thought, oh no, this is not really true. And but when I got to Seattle, Dale accompanied me on the plane. When I got to Seattle, it was true. Jean had died instantly of a gunshot wound through his heart as he tried to dodge the bullet. And Silme was in intensive care at Harborview with 5 bullet wounds to his stomach. But before he died, but before he was taken to the hospital, he managed to get up from the floor, go out in front of the Union, yell for help, loud enough so that the medic up the street heard him yelling for help, ran to his side, and the medic asked him, do you know who shot you? And he said, Ben Galloy and Jimmy Ramil. And from that moment on, from 4 o'clock in the afternoon on that June 1st, the murder conspiracy began to unravel. Within 24 hours, our comrades had gone back into the Union, mopped up the blood from the floor, and began servicing the workers the very next day. They were wearing bulletproof vests that a comrade from the line of march had been asked to find. Here's the money, go find 4 bulletproof vests. And she asked, where am I going to find those? I don't know where to find them. And they said, just find them. She came back with them, and some of our comrades were also armed because the murderers were still on the loose. But we had already begun to develop the theory behind who was responsible for their murders. A theory that over the 8 years leading up to the civil suit trial in federal court basically held firm. This theory was based on who Silme and Jean were, the work they were doing at the time of their deaths, and what were the interests that had most at stake with the work they and the KDP and Local 37 were doing. Was it the cannery? Was it the owners of the canneries that they had been organizing against? Or was it the Marcos regime? And those were the 2 interests best served by the murders of Silme and Jean. But immediately, a decision to cooperate with police, prosecutor attorneys' offices, and courts were made, and an appeal for justice was issued in order to break the terror, fear, and intimidation caused by the murders. This appeal for justice essentially called for all those to join a collective effort and to come forward with any information about the murders of Silme and Jean. It was signed by a broad spectrum of people, from city council members to Filipino community members, and as well, we forced the president of the union to sign it, the very first signature, and other members of the broader community. This was an important decision that we made because many groups would say, do not cooperate with those agencies because they're just tools of the state. But we knew that we didn't have the power to bring forth to prosecute those that had murdered Silme and Jean. 3 weeks after their deaths, over 100 people came together at Local 37 to form the Committee for Justice for Domingo and Viernes to assert that these murders were not the result of ordinary street crime. By then, Ben Galloy and Jimmy Ramil had been picked up and were being held for the murders of Silme and Jean. We asserted that, in fact, through the Committee for Justice, the murders were politically motivated and therefore served as a threat to all progressive forces involved in the struggle for social justice. A call for justice to rally behind the CJDV to get to the bottom of the murders and punish all those responsible. We laid out for our task to bring awareness of the murders and the underlying politics surrounding them to as broad a base of people as possible, to people who may have never heard or worked with Silme and Jean personally, but would understand the importance of finding justice, and secondly, to exert all pressure on agencies like police, courts, and the prosecuting attorney's office to help us find justice, but also hold them accountable, and as what was borne out, to expose their role in subverting justice in the very end. And third, we wanted, through the Committee for Justice, to halt the attacks against the members of Local 37 who were continuing to run that union side by side with the president who had helped arrange the murders, and other people that continue to do Philippine solidarity work and Filipino community work in Seattle and other places. And in the end, the Committee for Justice developed the theory, which I was going to show in the video so I wouldn't have to talk about it, and we were able to get 4 men in prison sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, and we won a landmark civil suit in federal district court against the higher levels in the murders. So essentially, what we were able to piece over the 9 years following the murders of Silme and Jean, and that's what it took us. We had made a commitment in the very beginning that we would not rest until justice was completely served in the murders of Silme and Jean. And of course, we never realized it would take us 9 to 10 years to do that. But many of us stayed with it, and we were able to claim victory. Maybe not a full victory, because the U.S. agencies were never prosecuted for their role in Silme and Jean's deaths. But Ferdinand Marcos, Imelda Marcos, Leonilo Malabed, who served as the conduit for the money that was paid for Silme and Jean's deaths, Tony Barruso, who is now in Walla Walla, serving life imprisonment without parole. He must be in his 70s without a chance of ever getting out. Was finally sentenced in 1990. And the gangsters who were paid to carry out the murders of Silme and Jean also were serving life imprisonment in Monroe and Walla Walla. But this is also a case of betrayal, because one of the hitmen was one of the young men that earlier I talked about when we did youth work. We worked in a group called the International District Youth Council. And that young man was a young man that we had worked with when he was an at-risk youth. Tony Barruso was a good friend of the family, worked side by side with our comrades, and he turned out to be one of the masterminds of the murder. But what was behind all of this was a pattern of harassment of the anti-Marcos movement, a network of Marcos agents who were sent to the United States in a Defense Intelligence Agency document, which we uncovered a few years after the murders, stated that these agents were sent to the United States to harass, intimidate, and ultimately act against the anti-Marcos movement. And in intelligence language, acting against means using physical violence against, and possibly murder, against this movement. And that is what they did to Silme and Jean and others in the anti-Marcos movement. We used that document in our case, in the civil suit, to prove the harassment and the cooperation and knowledge of the U.S. agencies in the violation of our civil rights, because our civil rights should be protected in terms of being able to voice opposition to U.S. foreign policy around the Philippines, and that's what Silme and Jean were doing. But we were never able to bring the U.S. agencies or the U.S. government to trial, to court, for their roles in the murders. And the reason is because they are protected by national security. A word that you have heard often, over and over again, in terms of Iraq, in terms of protection of diplomats, in terms of protection of our president, in carrying out many, many violations of our civil rights in this country. So that in this lawsuit, in this case, national security has been used over and over to protect those in our government that have only violated our rights. I want to close by saying there are two main reasons that we were able to achieve victory in Silme and Jean's case. And the biggest reason was that in 1986, Marcos was overthrown and a people's victory was declared by the people in the Philippines. And because of that movement, we were able to proceed in cooperation with the Aquino government to help prove our case, and without them blocking our efforts to bring those, the Marcoses to trial. And again, and also the movement here that we built in Seattle and nationwide, because the Committee for Justice for Domingo and Viernes went nationwide. And we built that movement. We never let them forget what Silme and Jean died for, and we kept our commitment to pursue justice. And I clearly remember the last day in the civil suit trial. It was the biggest courtroom. It held probably 125 people, and there was standing room only as the lawyers delivered their closing statements. And that was a victory for us. It was a victory because people did not forget what the Committee for Justice stood for, and that we were committed to the very end to get justice for Silme and Jean. And the fact that that many people believed that we would get that justice was a victory. And when they announced the verdict, about less than 24 hours later, that we had won the case, that was icing on the cake. Now, as all the other comments have talked about, in all the campaigns that we ever undertook, we used a myriad of tools to accomplish this. And the Committee for Justice, for the first year, was an intense type of political work. Not only because of the fear and intimidation that people faced as they carried out their work in the Union as well as in the Committee for Justice, but also because you have to remember, we were all still in our 20s. We ranged from 22 to probably 30. And here we were running a union with 1,500 members at that time. We were going to trial, working with prosecutors, trying to bring forth witnesses, trying to defend ourselves against gangs who were still trying to stop the work of the union. And we were still faced with the harassment of the Marcos regime. But we continued with our organizing. We continued, as always, with our propaganda. Every year we held a memorial for Silme and Jean and issued our statement of reiterating what the facts of our case were, what the state of the cases were, and always an update about what was happening in the Philippines. Year after year, the trial continued to get postponed. Here you'll see Marcos regime on trial October 16th, new trial date November 20th. The trial has been moved again to October, so time and time again, the trial was postponed due to different things. But we kept our propaganda machine going. We kept issuing update after update until we won the case. During the first year, we probably produced one of these a week. And every time we had a trial, we would go, when they were going to announce the verdict, we would have 2 press releases. And we'd have to make sure we didn't mix them up, because one would declare victory if they were prosecuted, and the other one would criticize if they were released. But we were always prepared to the most. We used our Angkatipunan to also nationwide publicize what was going on in the trial. We used other forms of literature that people were willing to print. This is Counterspy, in which we revealed the Defense Intelligence Agency document and used this famous picture with Barroso shaking hands with Marcos. He was ever so sorry he left this picture in the Union Hall. when Marcos came to visit in 1982, we used literature to publicize the connection with Silme and Jean's deaths to the Marcos dictatorship. And as people had talked about before, everywhere he went, we were there to follow him. And these became two very famous pictures of Silme and Jean that we used. This picture actually of Jean Viernes was when he was delivering the ILWU resolution. And the funny story about this picture is he asked me to buy this picture. He said, "I'll give you $1. Please go buy that picture." I said, "Why don't you go buy it?" He says, "No, you can't buy a picture of yourself." But he wanted to buy this picture because he said, "I don't want a Marcos agent to buy this picture, so please go buy it for me." And it's, as you can see, it's been the picture that we've used of Jean. We did many teach-ins connecting the themes of our work to other political assassinations. This one was a teach-in in which Isabel Letelier, the wife of the widow of former Chilean ambassador Orlando Letelier. Orlando Letelier was in the cabinet of Salvador Allende, thank you. And he was murdered on Embassy Row in Washington, D.C. His car was blown up, and Ronnie Moffett was with him. And Isabel Letelier came here to talk about the connection between U.S. foreign policy, repression abroad, and its connection with repression at home. Very much similar to what was happening in the Philippines and what happened to Silme and Jean here. And, you know, we have one of the, and as I said, every year we have a memorial for, we had a memorial for Silme and Jean with different speakers, and we continue to have a memorial every year, and we invite you to join us in June when we have that memorial. Lastly, while many people still do not know about who Silme and Jean were and don't know about our victory in our case, our civil suit still is very important because it was the first time a foreign dictator had ever been held responsible for murders of U.S. citizens in this country. And it made other dictators and other military personnel who were responsible for murders, it made them think twice about coming to the United States. And if people don't remember Silme and Jean, we have to continue to do education about Silme and Jean and what they stood for and the work that they were doing. But as well, we know that our legal case continues to have positive repercussions for those that are seeking justice for other people who have suffered human rights violations. And I'd like to close lastly by saying, you know, my son was born 11 years later on June 1st, the same day that Silme and Jean died. And I hope that he'll carry on Silme and Jean's legacy, just like I hope all of you will.